and nurses who care for these vulnerable citizens. I would now like to introduce the host of today's event, Sheila Service. Sheila is the Regional Director of Vancouver Island and the Chairperson of the CFUW National Long-Term Care and Elder Rights Study Group, of which we number just over 100 women from across the country. Thank you, Sheila, for your passion and leadership throughout this past year. Sheila, please go ahead.
Thank you. After seeing the devastating impacts of the COVID pandemic on long-term care residents and workers last year, the FUW members organized to adopt 2 national resolutions on long-term care. These resolutions aim to protect the most vulnerable in our communities by urging the provincial, territorial, and federal governments to work together to establish common evidence-based standards that ensure all Canadians can live in safety, comfort, and dignity, and have access to high-quality, affordable long-term care, and urging the creation of a universal, accessible, regulated, respectful, and quality long-term care for the growing needs of elderly persons by placing long-term care under the Canada Health Act. During the past few days, hundreds of Canadians have been taking action to change the way that Canada treats residents and workers in long-term care facilities. We've been writing letters, making signs, talking with friends and family, and raising awareness on social media, demanding urgent and systematic change to protect seniors and those who care for them. Today, we are joined by speakers from the country's 3 offices of the Seniors Advocates. They will each provide a provincial snapshot of their work advocating for seniors and describe the impacts of COVID-19 on seniors in their province. Only 3 of Canada's 13 provinces and territories, British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and New Brunswick, have independent offices whose mandate is to monitor, review, and analyze senior services and issues in their respective provinces by promoting their rights and interests. Each office's mandate is outlined in the Seniors Advocate Act or Child, Youth, and Senior Advocate Act in the case of New Brunswick. They differ slightly depending on the province. We will start with the West Coast with British Columbia's Seniors Advocate, Isabel McKenzie. Then we will travel across to St. John's, Newfoundland to hear from Pamela Daw, the Systemic Advocacy Consultant for the Newfoundland and Labrador Office of the Seniors Advocate. And we will finish with speakers from New Brunswick, Child, Youth, and Seniors Advocate Office, Gavin Coates, the Director of Seniors Branch, and Robert Savoy, the Supervisor of Individual Case Advocacy. We are also joined today by Maria Campbell, the Policy Advisor to the Minister of Seniors, Deb Schultz, who is observing today's discussion and will provide the Minister with a summary of what she heard. Isabel, I'll invite you to go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to the Canadian Federation of University Women's Clubs across Canada. I've been a member and an active member in my Victoria chapter many years ago, and I look forward to re-engaging with my local chapter as well. So I'm very much aware of all of the work that the clubs do across Canada, and I thank you for your time to spend with us this morning. So I think appropriate to start on the West Coast for many reasons. First of all, British Columbia experienced the first outbreak of COVID in long-term care, and tragically, we experienced the first death from COVID in long-term care here in BC. Perhaps it was because of our early experiences in the pandemic that we took rather swift action here in BC that really insulated British Columbia a bit in wave 1 relative to the experience in other parts of Canada, most notably in Ontario and Quebec, which had a much more severe wave 1 of COVID-19 on seniors living in long-term care and on their communities overall. However, what we did see in British Columbia as we progressed through the totality of this pandemic, and we're still not finished, is that when we came into wave 2 in the fall and wave 3 as we're in the throes of now, our experience was still a little bit milder in some aspects than some of the more populated provinces, but the degree to which it was different was much more compressed. Our experience in wave 2 and 3 was much more similar to other large provinces like Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta to our immediate east. And so what's interesting is from the perspective of this office, we look at the seniors overall, not just seniors in long-term care. And certainly over the course of the pandemic, a lot of attention was on what was happening in long-term care. And that is important. And there are critical issues that need to be addressed in long-term care. But the majority of seniors live in the community, even the vast majority of seniors over the age of 80. And so a lot of work in our office in the early part of the pandemic focused on how we were going to get groceries and medications and meals to the 200,000 plus seniors living in the community over the age of 80 in British Columbia. And that would be similar in other provinces as well. And so we focused on that a lot, and it revealed, I think, certain gaps in the community. But certainly the focus has been the revelation, if you will, of life in long-term care. And I think that what has happened is that Canadians have been awakened to what life is like in long-term care or nursing homes in Canada. It's important to understand that the vast majority of Canadians, and in fact, the vast majority of seniors, will never see the inside of a nursing home. So if we take British Columbia for an example, only 15% of people over the age of 85 live in a nursing home. And so most of us go about our day-to-day activities oblivious to what life is like for that very small minority of our seniors who, for a variety of reasons, find themselves in long-term care. And what happened uh, over the course of this pandemic is that the images of life in long-term care were reflected on screens and radio waves from coast to coast to coast, and we were awakened to the need for the many reforms that are required in our long-term care sector. Just prior to the pandemic, this office had released a report called A Billion Reasons to Care. And in that report, we highlighted some of the issues that have come to the forefront nationally in long-term care. And that may be the reason why British Columbia was able to pivot so quickly at the beginning of the pandemic and put in place very swiftly some measures that I think helped contain the degree to which we experienced the outbreak in wave 1 in long-term care. And that highlighted the issues you're all hearing about: the staff, the level of staffing, the pay for the staff that we have, the degree to which there are multiple people sharing a room. That's not as acute in British Columbia as it is, for example, in Ontario and Quebec, and some other provinces have a very high proportion of their long-term care beds are in single rooms. But certainly the staffing issue and the resource issue is prevalent across the country. So is an underlying theme of ageism, which is wrapped around wrapping around that is an overlying paternalism, which is very prevalent in long-term care. And we saw that certainly in how we address the issue of family members visiting their loved ones in long-term care. And that issue, without a doubt, was the dominant issue that my office dealt with in terms of the impact of long-term care or COVID-19 on long-term care in British Columbia, was the separation of these loved ones from their family members living in long-term care. And I think that we are really, in addition to looking at whether getting more residents into single rooms and getting more staff and the appropriate staff, we really do have to reflect on the absolute importance that family members have on the life of residents in long-term care. Not all residents, but for many residents, those are very critical relationships. And I think that when we look back on this pandemic, we will recognize that that is an issue that we could have and should have handled differently than we did. We did things for the right reasons to protect people in long-term care, but I think we didn't come to grips with the degree to which the importance of these family relationships to our loved ones in long-term care. So as we look to the future, certainly I think the attention and focus on long-term care is here to stay for the foreseeable future. And we certainly saw both a federal budget and then I think 2 days later or the next day here in BC, a provincial budget that indicated that governments are very, very much wanting to address issues in long-term care. It will be a long road. We didn't get to where we are overnight, and we're not going to fix where we are overnight. But I think the commitment is there, and the kind of forum that you're hosting today and the work of the CFUW, I think is another indication of a groundswell that is rising up that I believe is going to wash over long-term care in Canada and reform it so that when we're looking back 10 years from now, we'll be able to take great pride in the progress and achievements we've made. So I will turn it over now to my colleague in Newfoundland and look forward to questions and feedback from the group.
Okay. So I'm going to present a very different, in a lot of ways, scenario than Isabel has just done. And yet there are some similarities. First of all, in Newfoundland and Labrador, we had zero, okay, just kidding, hang on, okay.
Sorry, yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll let you know if I want to use the slides. I'm going to kind of just decide as we go. So
okay, perfect.
We had no deaths in long-term care in Newfoundland and Labrador. We had one case that I am aware of, and that person recovered. There were perhaps, I think, even fewer than 5 that, again, that we are aware of workers in a care facility. So that's interesting. So it's a very different end of the spectrum from what was experienced in British Columbia and other of the larger provinces. As Isabel had said, the number of people living in care facilities in Newfoundland and Labrador is very small. You're looking at perhaps 5,000 total. And when I say, and we divide, it's long-term care would be the people with the more acute needs, and then personal care homes. Long-term care homes are by and large publicly funded, publicly owned and operated. Personal care homes are private run businesses. So it's a little bit, I think we are different from province to province. When for our office, when the first wave hit, it was the most, I think the more calls we got to our office had to do with really more the confusion of what the guidelines mean, what a bit of a panic, I think. I will say that we had very few, and I can, and I say that like maybe 3-4 calls about, I need food and, that sort of thing, which was great. Now, government did set up a committee very quickly of to look at vulnerable cohorts of the population, and we were part of that. So with the seniors and sort of making sure that services were provided and everyone was getting what they needed, and a number to call, et cetera, et cetera. It's the community is mobilized very quickly, and we found that for our office, we didn't get a whole lot of calls about those sorts of things. I can't, I'm hungry, I can't get food. That didn't come up. What we got most of our calls about was the visitation guidelines for long-term care and personal care homes and hospitals. As Isabel said, we recognize that people, it was so important for people to be feel protected. Where, though, did it tip over into a paternalistic attitude and ageism? You know, I think, you know, it looks like one of these, you know, the best intentions were there, but the outcomes, and I think we're going to see as we examine it a little bit further, the outcomes are going to have a lot of unintended negative consequences, and we're seeing that. One of the biggest issues that we had in this province, besides the visitation and the lack of contact that families had with their loved ones, was the interpretation of the guidelines differing. So and depending on what alert level we were in, if the guidelines said no visitors, that which it did initially, that was it. So, but people could, you know, families were invited to window visit. We had facilities that didn't allow that. So we got a lot of calls from very distressed family members saying, I can't see her. I haven't seen her for weeks. Why won't they at least let us look in the window? And we got no real great explanation for that. It was just, this was their interpretation of what they could and could not do. So that, as you can imagine, was very problematic. As the visitation eased up and people were allowed to visit, family, friends, whatever, and you know, let's say initially when it was allowed one, then the issues that we ran into were some facilities said one person, you can come between the hours of 9 and 10 or 7 and 8 in the morning. That's it. And that's your visit for the day. Other facilities said, come whenever you want during the day. Come and go as you want. So there was mass confusion in that regard and upset, because depending from facility to facility, you know, I might have this rule because my parent is in this facility and my neighbor has a different set of rules because her parent, I mean, is in a different facility than mine, and the inequity of it all. It was so unfair. It became cruel. It became absolutely so sad. The other part that, and as Isabel said, in Newfoundland and Labrador, actually, just months before COVID hit, we had recommended a review of our long-term care system. So when COVID hit, COVID did indeed shine a light and open the doors to things that perhaps weren't a big surprise to many of us in this sector, but it let the world in. And as Isabel said, you know, it gave everyone a glimpse into life inside these facilities. And I think more than anything, one of the biggest issues that we also came across was the role that families played in, for lack of a better term, picking up the slack and helping out in the facilities. And when that stopped, the upset of, well, now who's doing it? Who's helping, you know, my aunt eat her meal? These sorts of things. And no assurances and the ability or the inability to check. I can't express how traumatizing it was for families, and for us on the other end to listen and truly not be able to do anything about it, except, and this was our role, is we liaise. We would go back to government and say, this is what we're hearing. this is what we've heard. Please, you've got to step in. Something's got to change. This can't continue. But it did continue. That was the first wave. This second wave, we're not getting those calls. It seems that people now have figured it out. They are still, the rules haven't changed. It's still 5 visitors or so. But I guess we've adapted. That's the only explanation that I have. Rightly or wrongly, that's what we've done. And, adjusted to the situation. But as we said, when we start reviewing and looking at what happened and what everyone went through, I think there's going to be some very, 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 very sad stories and experiences come out of the whole thing. Best of intentions, unintended bad results, I think. The only other thing that I'm just thinking is the other issue, the other real big issue that we found here in this province was just the challenges of, besides isolation, but the challenges of communication. Because of, in this province, not everybody even has really good access to internet. So that was an issue. All of a sudden, everything was coming via social media and, online. People were told to, press this link. Well, first of all, you had to have internet connection. And secondly, you had to have computers or iPads in order to do that. So that was a huge issue. Again, these were problems we had beforehand. As government and government programs and services became more digitalized and technology advanced, we were having these problems. COVID just blew it up and said, we're going to have to, right now, it really did expedite everything. We have to look at it now. I think I'll stop there. I don't want to go on too long. I mean, I think any of us can talk for days on this experience of ours. So I'll stop there and we'll pass it on to New Brunswick.
Thanks very much, Pamela. Yeah, so I mean, Isabel and Pamela, of course, spoke on very different situations through the pandemic, but very similar. Our office is very similar to theirs. And my name's Gavin Kotze. I'm the Director of Systemic Advocacy for the Child, Youth and Seniors Advocate in New Brunswick. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint, I think, for this. Not that I'm not prepared, but I just had to run quickly from a presentation to a committee at the legislature, hence wearing a tie. For the first time in the pandemic, I've had to wear a tie. It's deeply uncomfortable. I forgot how uncomfortable this is. But I'm going to go through a slideshow, and I'm here with Robert Savoie, who is the coordinator of individual case advocacy at our office. And Robert can interrupt me and correct me whenever I say things that are wrong, essentially. All right, here we go. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. We'll see how this goes. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to do a fancy little maneuver. And I believe you now all see this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes, perfect.
Perfecto. Okay, so let me start it here. Sorry, just 1 second. I wonder if I can do it that way. Pow, that's better. I don't really want that. All right, here we go. I won't actually see any questions that come up. I'm really sorry. This is very, it's problematic, but
No
That's
problem.
okay.
If questions come in, we'll just relegate them all to towards the end anyway. So
Sounds
not
good.
to worry. Okay, perfect.
Okay, I've made this full screen somehow. Okay, so I just want to talk quickly about the mandate and then the operations of our office, briefly about human rights of older persons, and then a bit about advocating in pandemic times. The issues around long-term care unquestionably have been, I mean, those are deep issues, and they stem, I think, as Isabel and Pamela pointed out quite rightly, from systemic ageism, and managing to get to the bottom of those issues and really find a design for long-term care that actually works. That's going to be quite a project for our country. But I believe it is possible. So our office is a legislative officer, hence me having to go down to the legislature today. I don't usually have to do that, but today I was presenting to a committee on child and youth rights, because our office started over a decade ago as a legislative officer, much like an auditor general or ombud for child and youth rights. And a few years ago, 3 exactly, I believe, we were given an extra mandate for seniors. Now, we were not given extra resources to do this, so it has been a somewhat slow climb, but we have managed in the last few years to grow to some degree. The Act itself provides, well, I'll go into some of our operations and what it provides, but essentially it gives powers of full access to information, of documents, any documents that any government department or agency has, whether that's in a file or electronic or voice or video. We can have access to that unless it's solicitor-client privilege or cabinet privilege. And I'll explain why that's important in a minute. Our mandate, it's in the legislation, but essentially it's protecting and advocating for the rights and interests of seniors. Important in that respect is ensuring that seniors' opinions are heard and considered in matters that affect them. Now, for children and youth, this is actually a human right found in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in Article 12 of that treaty. It's reflected in human rights norms for older adults as well, but we don't have that particular article in a particular treaty. But quite obviously, it's imperative in order for rights to be protected for those who may be victims of rights violations to be heard. The mandate is also ensuring that older persons have access to services that they're entitled to legally, and that when they have complaints about those services, that there's an administrative process to actually deal with those complaints. We provide advice to government on the rights of seniors and the interests of seniors, and the efficacy of government programs, or lack of efficacy, as the case may be. And then we generally try to raise awareness about the rights and interests of seniors. Older adults is usually the terminology we use, but in our legislation, it is seniors. So this is a new mandate, as I mentioned before. I guess it's 4 years now, climbing up to 4 years, July of this year. We have 7 staff members that work on our child and youth branch and seniors branch combined, and then 2, including Robert and another advocate, Simon, who are dedicated fully to the seniors branch. Okay. And then we have, we won't go into detail here, but basically we have jurisdiction over any entity of government. So at the provincial level and the municipal level. We also have jurisdiction over nursing homes and special care homes. And that's important because here in New Brunswick, nursing homes are actually private operations, as are special care homes. And So generally speaking, our office does not have jurisdiction to investigate or demand documents from or compel a witness to appear before us in terms of private businesses or organizations. So we can't tell Tim Hortons to do this, but we can actually do this for nursing homes and special care homes, and for organizations that are contracted to provide home support services as well. And what we do, there are two aspects to our work, well, beyond education and outreach. There's systemic advocacy and individual case advocacy. Individual case advocacy is what Robert takes care of in our office, along with Simon. And so we'll get a call or an email, sometimes a fax even, and someone has an issue. And then the first thing that we do, of course, is determine whether we have jurisdiction to look at that. And if we do, then we will advocate. And usually this means taking a mediatory approach, because very often there's just a situation where someone is in a bad position, but can't seem to get, doesn't know how to get a remedy, essentially. And we facilitate that remedy. Sometimes if an issue becomes intractable, it's often because different government departments are involved and none of them think that it's actually their issue per se, but it's actually an issue that needs a collective response from different government departments. So we'll facilitate that and mediate that. Sometimes that doesn't work out, and it usually does, but sometimes it does not. And when it does not, we would undertake systemic advocacy as needed. And this can take two forms, really, three in actual fact. But so it may be that there's a particular situation that occurs, and we think this points to a broader problem. For example, at the moment, we are doing a systemic investigation of a homicide in a nursing home. And this homicide was in I can't give any details about it, obviously, but it was in a dementia wing of a nursing home, and the perpetrator of the homicide was not charged criminally, because in order to be criminally responsible, you have to have mens rea and actus reus. The guilty mind is part of this. The guilty act, yes, but the guilty mind as well. And if someone doesn't actually know what they're doing or know the consequences of that, then they won't be charged or prosecuted. So the coroner actually was the one who called this a homicide, but the courts have not. Yet we have family members who are deeply grieving, and a situation where a lot of questions were raised around how the nursing home handled physical altercations within the nursing home prior to this incident, to this tragedy. So we might do that. And then what the idea there is that we will look at this, but from the lens of that one issue, that one individual case, and from there make recommendations in terms of practice standards and policies, regulations, or even legislation. The other thing we might do, and we do this regularly with child and youth advocacy, and we're beginning to get there with older persons as well, is to look at a system as a whole, and much like the Billion Reasons to Care report from BC, undertake a review of that system and make recommendations to government on how to change that system for the better, to be more rights respecting. So legislative change, regulatory policy, or practice. The other thing we would do is sometimes it's quite obvious that there's a problem. For example, in terms of special care homes and nursing homes in this province, someone can be discharged with 2 weeks notice. However, under the Residential Tenancies Act, if you're renting an apartment, you get a month notice before you're evicted. So there are fewer protections for these very vulnerable people in these institutions. And so that simply for us is a recommendation to government without a big review, without a big investigation, saying there's a legislative gap here, you need to fix it. We recommend that you do so. Okay. Our advocacy is founded on human rights law. So of course, in Canada, this means constitutionally the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and also international human rights law, and which is, I mean, I'm familiar with CFUW through your amazing book sales. And I've certainly donated a lot of money over the years to your organization through those book sales. But what I had not understood, and it's such a wonderful thing now to know, and I hope to follow up further with this, is the role of advocacy for your organization, and the way it's founded on advocating for Canada to not only join international human rights instruments like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, for example, but also implement them. And that's really the trick. So Canada has ratified all of the core human rights treaties. And I won't go into great detail here, but essentially there's a paradox in the sense that Canada as a nation, we premise our foreign aid, for example, on human rights, and our foreign policy very much on human rights. And yet we are very much not a leader in implementing international human rights law in our country. In many other countries, it's automatically part of their domestic law, sometimes automatically part of their constitutional law, like in Belgium. But in Canada, it is not. And the way we try to make these international human rights law obligations into law here is convoluted and frankly, not very comprehensive. So it's a problem. Yet when we look to advocacy for human rights within our mandate, we're looking to those international human rights law standards. Okay. There's also the United Nations Principles for Older Persons. This is not law per se, it's a declaration. Well, not actually, it's principles, but soft law it's often called. But these principles reflect international human rights law norms that are found in treaties. So, it's spelled out in detail in the actual document, but these principles are independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment, and dignity. And we then align our advocacy with human rights through treaties and domestic law, but in relation to these broad categories. During the pandemic, we have had an increase in complaints. And this is very useful. I mean, again, I think meeting Isabel and Pamela has been really good. We have been lax on collaboration and communication between our offices, and certainly we hope to increase that. But as Isabel said, there are only 3 of these offices in Canada, and there's no national commissioner. And I think a national commissioner is also necessary because, for example, Indigenous persons are within federal jurisdiction under law, as it's called, but as is, many areas, as are many areas of law like criminal law and immigration and refugee law. So important to have a national commissioner, a national advocate, but also one in each province and territory. And I think that, everyone on this call can probably be pushing for that and advocating for that in your own jurisdictions. But we've had these increases, and what this meant for us was, we had questions come to us and complaints come to us, and as Pamela was saying, right away there was a very intense response to the pandemic. No one knew what they were doing, right? I mean, obviously this is unprecedented, and in a crisis things happen, and human rights are not given the protections always that they would be in non-crisis times. And so this real focus on health protection versus human rights such as liberty, and security of the person and those things really was felt. And for example, we had a complaint come in that when older persons were moved from a nursing home to a hospital, whether it was just for a simple procedure, for a day surgery even, and then they went back to the nursing home, they had to isolate in that nursing home for 2 weeks.
Mm.
And we felt that we wanted to know the evidence base for that, essentially. And it's very difficult to get a good evidence base for that because this has never been done before. And so we met with government, they changed we also looked at what other provinces were doing, and it was very different around, some provinces were doing that, but not most provinces. So government here changed that. They felt it was an overreach. There were other examples of, when there was a breakout in a nursing home and a family member wanted to take their mother out and was refused that. Well, that's quite obviously severe deprivation of liberty, right? Essentially, you are imprisoning this person in that nursing home. And if it is safe to remove that person, then presumably it's hard to justify not allowing a family member to take that person out. In any case, that changed as well, but there were a number of these kinds of issues that have come up, and I think that they point to the situations in nursing homes in general, and the idea that we need to actually have people in there seeing what's happening, and not necessarily in a watchdog sense, but you do need an independent advocate. I firmly believe you need an independent advocate in long-term care, shedding light on these issues. Okay, surely I'm nearly done. Oh, what happened there? Oh, there we go. I'll skip that. Yeah, I think this is true. The pandemic has shown very starkly for us in any case, the situations of older persons in long-term care facilities and their vulnerability to neglect. We've seen instances of that, of course, deprivation of liberty, discrimination, isolation. And in the pandemic, suddenly a lot of these facilities were a black box, right? Very difficult for anyone to get information. And a lot of our information came from workers in these homes who were complaining to us and or bringing their complaints, I should say, to us, bringing their fears to us, bringing their deep concerns to us. And then I think the other aspect of advocating in these pandemic times is just that we need to really change the narrative around older persons, in terms of public policy, and ensure a focus on human rights. Because when you do that, then older persons have agency, older persons have voice, and older persons have protection. And that's it. No, that's my whole thing. And that's how to reach us. And I'll send this to Charlotte, who can disseminate it maybe. Now I'll stop sharing.
Yes.
Nope. Why does it say new share? Uh-oh. Can you stop me, Charlotte?
Yeah, let me.
Oh, wait, I can do it.
try.
I can do it.
You got it?
Did it.
Okay, perfect. Now let me
So
just
thank you very much, Isabel, Pamela, and Gavin. And with your permission, we're now going to subject you to questions. And I know that my colleagues are monitoring the chat, but I'd just like to ask to start out, the idea of a national commissioner is a new thought for me, and I wonder if you could give us some indication of how we might go about beginning to advocate for that. And I'd appreciate hearing from all three of you.
Well, since I raised it, I guess I'll go first. That's a great question, Sheila. That's a very good question. I mean, there's no point in talking about this stuff unless we can talk about actual action and remedies. So, there is no child and youth national advocate. Okay, there's a child and youth advocate in every province except now Ontario, and also in 2 territories. And there's an organization by which those advocates work together. But those advocacy offices do recommend a national commissioner. The Canadian Bar Association, the biggest organization of lawyers in the country, recommends a national commissioner for children and youth. And there have been private member bills. Mark Garneau famously brought one forward. There have been others. There's one right now, actually, from the Senate, in fact, to create this. And yet it has not happened. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually had a recommendation. One of their calls to action was to create a national commissioner for children and youth, because of course, Indigenous children do not have an advocate per se, right? And a lot the funding for child welfare, for education for Indigenous children is federal funding. So it remains a problem, but I think it has all been grassroots advocacy from a lot of different organizations. And I think that probably you could just talk to your local MPs.
Okay. Pamela?
Thank goodness I'm not the only one who did that. I did
knew I was
that
gonna do
maybe
it,
before the
right?
whole thing started. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I would really like to see, first of all, I think the provinces themselves getting some, you know, a designated person, office, or whatever it is for looking at long-term care. So whether it's a seniors advocate's office, and you know, because right now, like we said, we're only 3, and our mandates are not just long-term care. That's a piece of it, a big piece without a doubt. But you know, it is hard. So I think if we could look at getting the provinces and territories to you know to look at this, each one of them, and then we could look at a national body, whatever that is. But you know, again, it's, you know, for us, we look at capacity. We are in our office, our seniors advocate actually has just retired. So there are 2 of us, 2 consultants for the entire province, and we have an administrative person as well. So, and a budget of less than 500,000, right? So you know, there's that to look at. But I do think and I would agree with Gavin. It is, you lobby your MPs, you know, have that conversation. There is a minister responsible for seniors at the federal level, having that conversation with her and pushing this issue. This is, you know, the thing is, it is an issue, and we say this for not just long-term care, but seniors issues. This is something that, you know, God willing, we are all going to have a stake in at some point. We might not all be living in long-term care facilities, but we are all going to get older. So what we're doing now is self-serving in a lot of ways. But, you know, like I said, it is the one issue that we can all say, you know, we've got, we're all invested in.
Thank you, Pamela. Isabel, could we hear from you, please?
So just building on what Gavin and Pam have said, basically a national seniors advocate or a seniors commissioner, not a bad thing, but I do think that a national level voice can raise profile, can be a repository of best practices, of pan-Canadian research, of that kind of thing. But the day-to-day lives of seniors are impacted for the most part by what provinces do. I actually think if you had to prioritize, I would place a higher priority on having a seniors advocate in each province than a national one. Now, that could be what the role of the national person does is drive the provincial presence of, or in each province, a presence of the office. But I think then that's the challenge the federal government has right now. It's fairly clear. It's a national voice. We're on a national platform today, demanding reforms in long-term care, but we live in a federated world where the provinces are responsible effectively for delivering long-term care. The provinces are responsible for the home care and supporting the seniors at home. The provinces are responsible for the housing, for the transportation. At every turn, other than OAS, CPP, and GIS, everything is a provincial jurisdiction. Now, every province, I think, receives some form of transfer payment from the federal government, and you can put strings to it. But I can tell you that there is always this tug of war between provinces guarding their autonomy and the federal government's desire to direct outcomes from the money that they give. So is it a good idea? Yes. Is it a panacea? No. I think that having each province have a seniors advocate is ultimately more effective. I think it is a challenge for smaller provinces. Both Pamela and Gavin, we're a population of 5 million here in British Columbia. So on a per capita basis, my office's size may be similar to Pam's and Gavin's, but there's a basic infrastructure you need for any office, whether it's serving the 5 million people in British Columbia or the 500,000 people in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so, part of more formalizing and recognizing that, I think, might give better resources to smaller populations that still need a basic infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my colleagues who are monitoring the chat to give me an update on what questions might be in the chat.
Yeah, sure. So I have a question that I believe all speakers could give us their insight on. A question is, how is paternalism or extreme control counteracted by family members? So how can paternalism be, the paternalism they face in long-term care homes be counteracted by the family members? Or maybe perpetuated in a way. So it could be two sides of that coin.
Well, no one's diving in. All right, I'll do it. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's deeply ingrained, quite obviously, right, in our society. But I think the one thing that's really important to note is that I would agree with Isabel that having provincial and territorial advocates for older persons is more of a priority than a national one. I would also say that, if you look at the name of our office, it's the Child, Youth, and Senior Advocate Office. Quite obviously, older persons were an add-on. Seniors were an add-on to this. And we were given $200,000 above our usual $1 million budget to advocate for seniors. So it was really quite pointless. So I think that and there are only 3 of these offices in the country. So right away, we're talking about a real lack of institutional advocacy going on. But the biggest advocates are always family members. This is true for children and youth too, right? The biggest advocates, generally speaking, are parents. And for older persons, it's family members, maybe their children. I think, some of it has to come from just outreach and education, and this idea, the term ageism was not particularly a prevalent term 20 or 30 years ago, right? I think that we're doing better, and I think families can can get there just by looking at older persons in whatever, whatever state of vulnerability they're in, in long-term care or elsewhere, as subjects of human rights, not objects, right? And taking that rights-based approach versus a needs-based approach. And I guess that's probably the best I can do. There's no quick fix.
So, Pamela, you?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree. It's tricky though. Families will call and we will talk to them and explain, encourage them to advocate. But we often get a lot of calls from people who say they're afraid of repercussions. And that's a fact. And we all like to think, no. But human nature, people don't like to be criticized. People don't like fingers pointed at them. So we get a lot of calls about issues of concerns that families have after the person has passed away. And they will always say, I didn't speak up before because I was afraid, mom was there and we didn't want to be the trouble family. We've heard that. And they always say, but we don't want it to happen to someone else. So there is that. But of course you have, because if you don't speak up for your family, then who will? But we have a culture, I think, within institutions, and as long as we I'm not going to use the word passive, of desensitization, I suppose, where people, the number of people in facilities are counted as beds. We have, there's 100 beds here. There are 100 people living there. Is that what you mean? And the staff themselves, and again, not a criticism, but this is what happens is, you stop seeing a lot of times the person and you see the task. So therefore, I think, families need to keep reminding everyone around their loved one who was in the facility that this is a person, this is a human being, this is my mom. Make it humanize, the situation. This is where they live. This is their home. So, but you must speak up. One thing that happens all the time that I hear is, talking, the staff talking over the person to the family. So, would he like to have, ice cream this evening with his dinner? Ask him. It's just how it becomes a task. And I have friends of mine who, will always say, ask them. But the family has to be vigilant and just keep on it. But we have a culture that's got to change, and change is slow. But I think, you keep chipping away at it and keep encouraging families to talk and to bring their concerns forward. And while I understand being afraid of repercussions, you will not get change if you just say nothing. So there we go.
Thank you, Pamela. I think, Isabel, it's your turn.
Okay, this is a tough one. I predict everybody on this call has practiced paternalism. I was in home and community care for 20 years, and the families are right up there with the care providers. And it comes to this underlying ageism might be part of the description. But this is not going to be easy to solve, because what we as a society have to be prepared to do is to recognize that an individual's right of autonomy doesn't have an expiry date. And one of the fundamental rights of autonomy is to decide where you're going to live, who you're going to live with, and what kind of risk you're going to choose to live with. And what has happened is that as people have become visually more frail to us, more vulnerable, maybe not as quick off the mark, we have projected onto them a need to quote unquote protect them. It's complicated by the fact some people want to be protected and others don't. So if you think about all the variety of personalities that are out there at the age of 30, those variety of personalities still exist at 90. So you're going to have the person who, you know, gets the rust undercoating for their car, even though they live on the West Coast where we don't salt the roads and they have every insurance policy going. And then you're going to have the person who throws caution to the wind and rides their motorcycle without a helmet, and everything in between. So, you know, it isn't easy. We are all guilty of it. I've been guilty of it. I can't think of the number of times, you know, one of the things my colleagues and I are very guilty of, we'll refer to my residents want this, my residents think this, like embedded in that language is an unbelievable degree of paternalism. But here's the thing, when you're in the care home, I can assure you, some of those residents love being called sweetie and honey.
Yeah.
Usually they're the men. And then, but others recoil at that. Some can't wait to have people do things for them. Others deeply resent that and would rather not have it done than have somebody do it for them. It's not easy. I think that because there's always going to be this balancing act, right? When does it tip over? Because there is absolutely a point in time at which, as a civilized society, we have to recognize that a person actually doesn't have the capacity to have insights into the risk they're choosing to live with, and we do have a duty to intervene. But that tipping point isn't when they choose to live at risk, which many of us assume means they don't have the capacity to understand the risk they want to live with. And the classic that I see is around all the fussing when we're trying to convince mom or dad that they have to go into assisted living or long-term care because of the risk at home. And we engage the case manager as our ally because we are trying to convince everybody that mom can't possibly understand, doesn't have capacity to make this decision, or she wouldn't choose to live at home because look at the risk she's at living with. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, with all that's happened in long-term care over COVID that I hope has put to rest is this fallacy that you're safer in a care home than you are living in your own home. You know, forget COVID. Before COVID, those of us who work in the area know that, you know, residents still fall in long-term care. There's still medication errors. We still screw up their meds. They still develop pressure ulcers. They still, fall into depression and lose weight. All of those risks are still there. And more importantly, they still die, right? So how much of all of this paternalism, certainly what I saw was families desperate to keep any shred of mom with them, right? And there's no care plan I have ever been part of developing that has a goal of care immortality. And that, I think, is really what we're wrestling with at the end of the day, is the subtext. So it's not easy. It starts with solving these things, starts with acknowledging them. And that's really where we are right now. We're in our infancy on this, but there is absolutely a thread that weaves through it all.
I have a question about communication issues that Pamela raised in Newfoundland, and that maybe is universal across the country. That communication issues and digital access is a crisis for seniors, not only during COVID, but certainly it's been raised during COVID, that the unequal access that seniors have to digital access and their ability to use the digital tools that are available. Is there anything that advocates' offices can do to deal with that, to help seniors become more digitally competent, so that they can reach out and ask for help and become more able to connect with their families during COVID, after COVID, connect with resources that they need to become more able to take care of themselves? Isabel, do you want to take that first?
I'm going to focus on one element of it, which is cost. So I'm going to put aside the issue of knowing how to use the technology and actually having that piece of hardware. A third of Canadians are on the GIS, seniors, pardon me, well, Canadians are on the GIS, the Guaranteed Income Supplement. They have very low annual income. So, you know, around about $24,000, $25,000 a year max, and a lot of them around $22,000. We don't have low cost internet. And I know there's a federal person on the call here. What we need is CRTC leadership around low-cost internet. We sort of missed the mark with low-cost cable. We've sort of skipped over that, right? People actually don't need cable. They need internet, and it is expensive, particularly on a low income, particularly when somebody doesn't want to bundle it together with a gazillion other things. They're just the 75-year-old living in their one-bedroom apartment that doesn't include internet. And in BC, they're going to have to come up with $1,200 a year, basically, just to get the internet. We need a version of skinny internet so that there's not a financial barrier, because I think that's a bigger barrier than we realize.
And did you want to talk about, Pamela, did you want to talk about that for Newfoundland? With a lot of outputs and what have you out there?
I would agree with Isabel as well. What we found in the first wave was that, and again, this issue was always there. COVID just shone a light on it. What we found was the idea of Facebook, Zoom, FaceTime, all of these words, all of these technologies, first panicked everyone who wasn't familiar with it. How does it work? What do you mean I can FaceTime, mom or dad? And we had staff in facilities who were using their own phones or using their own iPads to help people who live there, connect with the outside world, because they didn't have that technology. We still had phones, but not everybody had a phone either. That was the other thing. And there are parts of this province where cell phones don't work. So, there's that. But I would say that one of our, and again, pre-COVID, and it continues, is that as services and programs or access to them, forms, et cetera, become digitized. As I said before, click the link. People are having to try to catch up or run into some great trouble. For example, right now in Newfoundland and Labrador, motor vehicle services is, how you get in the mail. We used to get in the mail anyway, your registration renewal, that no longer happens. So you have to you can go online and register, to have an email sent to you to remind you, or you can just try to remember. I can't remember that. So, like, I'm being honest. So, that's, the technology is just running ahead of us in a lot of cases faster than people trying to catch up. And we see it. So right now, like, we would recommend, a multidisciplinary approach to things. Yeah, okay, that's fine. We're going to get online, all of us, at some point, but we're not there yet. So offer options, at least for those people who are sitting there with no help. Not everybody has access to family. Not everybody is linked into their community. People live in isolation. That's a fact. Physical and socially, they're just isolated. So again, if we can get it and make it affordable, that's there. And then there has to be the will to learn it. We've had this happen where, people don't want anything to do with it, whether they have to, they're being told that, it's coming and you need to do this, you need to learn it. If you want to access this program, you're going to have to. And so there's resistance as well. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
I have another question. Women are engaged in family advocacy with their children, going to school and working hard to do work at school, helping their children do better. And they're also working with their elderly parents and long-term care, or making sure they get the service that they need at home. So this is really a women's issue. Long-term care is a women's issue. And there was a suggestion that a parent, like in parent advocacy councils at school, are there family advocacy councils at long-term care centers that that have been set up, that are working well? Do advocates recommend that kind of thing? Do you want to comment on family advocacy units in long-term care? Or are we circling back to paternalism again? Anybody can take this question.
Yeah, I
Graham,
saw
do you
that.
start?
Oh, sorry.
Go
Go ahead.
Who was it, Pam?
No, you go ahead, Graham.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. It was very interesting from Catherine Collett. And, parent advisory committees for schools, right? So here, they're called different things in different jurisdictions, right? Because education is provincial jurisdiction. But they are created through law, right? They're created through legislation or regulations made pursuant to legislation. So they have that legal status. And I think, right away, intuitively, I saw that comment and I thought, what a great idea. And there's so many of these ideas that we have for children and youth and protecting them that could transfer to seniors, right? So just the very idea of addressing paternalism. I mean, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was created because, and historically, children were property of their parents. They had no rights of their own. They were chattel. And there was a need to shift this paternalism from, a needs-based approach to a rights-based approach. And the same kind of conversation seems to be happening with seniors. And here in New Brunswick, not only do we have those sorts of, parent advisory committees or parent-teacher associations in schools, but we have something called integrated service delivery for children and youth. And that's where child and youth teams will come together and get a common plan for a child or youth who has complex needs. And that would involve child welfare, health, and education, and if need be, public safety or justice, and community or anyone else can be brought in on an ad hoc basis. And the reason for that was that a situation would happen and health would think it was an education issue, and education would think it was a health issue or a social development issue. But in actual fact, it was an issue that was complex and needed a holistic response. So we have these for children and youth, but where are they? Where's this approach, this integrated service delivery approach for seniors in New Brunswick? It does not exist. And we're doing right now a systemic investigation on a situation of a woman who was suffering from severe paranoid delusions and was evicted from provincial housing because she would not turn on the power because, you know, she had ideas about what the power was doing to her. And then so you have New Brunswick Housing, a government entity. You have Adult Protection, another government. These are different ministries. Well, that's actually two branches of one ministry. And then you have, you know, health as well. And they're not working together, and there was no coordinated response. So what happened with this lady was she just became homeless and then she disappeared. And, you know, we see, you know, if it was a young person and they were suffering from paranoid delusions and they left home and they were homeless and they weren't going to school and they weren't accessing mental health supports, there would actually be a solution. But there was no solution for this. So I think, you know, great idea to have these parent, you know, or family advisory committees, let's call them, for long-term care facilities. Great idea. Lobby the governments in your jurisdictions to get those. But there are all of these other ways that we can have government working together in teams rather than in silos to address these problems. That's the end of my spiel.
Do other advocates want to comment on the idea of family advocacy councils?
Sure, we addressed this in our most recent report on the visitor survey, and we had been talking about it before COVID. So in British Columbia, every long-term care home in regulation states that care home should have a resident and or family council. Sometimes they're together, sometimes it's just residents, sometimes it's just family. There's no enforcement mechanism, and there's a movement to get that enforced. But from my perspective, what I think is crucial is that there needs to be a provincial body where all these resident and family councils would percolate up. So if we use the Parent Advisory Council example, in BC, we have the BC Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils. Because what I observed during the pandemic was that the province turns to stakeholders for consultation on what to do. So when it came to long-term care, they talked to the unions who represent people who work there. They talked to the industry association that represents the operators, because 2/3 of our care homes are contracted here in BC. There was no group to turn to hear the voice of residents and family members. And we need that, without a doubt. The issue of paternalism, we need to remember that by definition, a person in long-term care is in need of some protections, not always protections around cognitive function, and we need to remember that. That's why there are good resident councils as well. In some, it depends on who's in what care home, but I think it's crucial. And in BC, we had one care home where it was put under public administration. The quality of the care was so poor that the government actually stepped in and took over for several months. Those issues would not have come to the attention of the health authority if it had not been for the family members in that care home. Inspections didn't pick it up.
Pamela, did you have any further additions to this comment about family advocacy councils?
I do know that some facilities in Newfoundland and Labrador do have these groups or committees, whatever you'd like to call them, and but they aren't in all. And my understanding is that they aren't mandated, certainly at least not at this point. But they do seem to work well. My only issue that I think they're great ideas, and I think we should absolutely push for them. Again, it comes down to the communication piece. Back in the day, I was an educator, and there are certain families really plugged in and knowing everything that's going on, and then there are many families who aren't. And I think the same thing could happen is with these groups. You have to make sure that at least, all of the families have an opportunity for their say, to make their concerns known to this group or whatever you want, this committee within these facilities. because otherwise, again, you're only going to hear from those people who know that it's going on. I have had people say to me, who knew? We didn't know this group existed in the facility, and it had been there for years. So again, a communication breakdown there. So if you're going to have them, and they're great to have, I think, is just to make sure that that everyone is aware that it's there and that they can have input.
Thank you. I have a question about the baby boomer cohort. The baby boomer cohort is approaching the long-term care placement as we get older. And as a member of that cohort, I feel that pressure. Will that cohort bring about change just by sheer numbers? Because we're such a big, bulky unit of people, do you imagine as advocates that with our numbers coming up in the system, that we'll create change just because of who we are and how many we are? Isabel, do you want to take this question?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So the leading edge of the baby boom is 75. The average age of a person in long-term care, certainly in BC, is 85. Most people will never go to long-term care, but the fact is that what boomers have had, most of them won't have had an experience with long-term care, but they'll have seen an experience of aging with their parents. So, you know, yesterday it was my grandmother, today it's my mother, tomorrow it's me. And I think that we are going to make demands for change. We are going to be wanting more choice. We will be more accepting of help than the current generation that's 85 plus, and that's going to be helpful in terms of staying at home. But I think without a doubt, the boomers are the sense of entitlement of the generation that will be in long-term care in 10 or 15 years is profoundly different from the sense of entitlement of the group that's living there now. The calls for reform aren't coming from the people living in long-term care. The calls for reform are coming from the people who are thinking, I'm not going to put up with that. And what we're underappreciating is what people are putting up with, because they're expecting less, and we're going to expect more.
I would agree. Anybody else want to chime in here, Pam?
I just wanted to jump in there. We're already seeing changes. You know, we are seeing that the boomers, as they are aging, we're hearing from them. They're not going to put up with it. I'm on the other end of it. I'm in my 58th year this year. So, and I go through this with my own parents. I put up with very little. And she puts up with a lot, and there's 20 years between us. So we know as we start moving up here, we're going to see a very different group of seniors. One thing too that hasn't come up is, and I know we are talking about long-term care, but you know, quite frankly, I want to stay home. I want to age in place. Most people do. There is a place for long-term care, and there's a place for personal care homes, without a doubt. But I'm not entirely convinced that spending oodles and oodles of money on these huge institutions, when we could redirect a portion of that to keeping people safe in their own homes where they want to be. And in Newfoundland, again, you know, what happens is people have to leave their community in a lot of cases to go to a facility. People don't want to do that. And boomers really don't want to do that. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes we're going to see down the road.
Graham, did you have any comments on that, or Robert?
Sure. I mean, I think that that's absolutely true what Isabel and Pamela have said. I think the other thing to bear in mind, I think, is that, for example, New Brunswick has a senior strategy that's largely premised on aging in place. And some strategies by government are produced and then not resourced or not implemented effectively. And I think the difference here is going to be that the boomer generation, as Isabel was saying, does have, you could call it a sense of entitlement, you could call it a sense of awareness of their rights. Or the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was enacted in 1982. And that created quite a shift in our society in terms of how we look at government and government's obligations to citizenry. So yes, again, short answer, absolutely. There will be profound changes. We just have to make sure those profound changes are directed in evidence-based and human rights respecting ways.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our questions. I know that there are other questions that you've already answered in terms of how to lobby for, how to get national standards, mandated 4 hours care per day, staff receiving adequate salaries, ensure on-site inspections, place long-term care under the Canada Health Act. One of our members wanted to ask that question, and you've already answered it by saying, talk to your provincial legislatures and talk to your members of parliament. But that was answered early on in the session. So thank you for your time. I'll turn it back over to Sheila.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming, in particular, Gavin, Pamela, and Isabel. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I think you have given us a direction in which we need to think about going, and that is with provincial seniors advocates and perhaps moving on to a national commissioner at some point in time. At least we have some ideas on where to go. So we do appreciate your taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us today and help us spread a little more light on seniors. And thank you all of the rest of you who came in to share in the day. And there is some information being put into the chat by Charlotte with links for letter writing and other activities that can happen. So that being said, thank you again for your attendance and have a good rest of your day.
Charlotte,
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Charlotte, did you have other activities that you wanted to take part in for the rest of this session?
Yeah, so I just sent a link to our website, which has all of the photos and quotes and testimonials so far, and that that link also includes a link to the toolkit where you can find, template letters and such, and ideas to advocate for change. And I think if anyone just wants to stay on, just to have a chat about your day or days of action, I think that would be great to just have sort of a coffee hour type of discussion if you feel free to stay on. And again, I just want to thank Susan Johnson for raising the issue of, this is a women's issue, and as a women's advocacy organization, we are really pushing for improving the status of all women and girls in Canada. And, over 90% of workers in long-term care homes are women. Over 2/3 of residents are women in long-term care. So this is, really a deeply, feminist cause to support for, elder justice. So again, thank you for everyone for joining, and I'll link all of the opportunities in the chat. And again, feel free to stay on and we can have a sort of a roundtable casual chat about what people have been doing over the past couple of days. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to the advocates again. Very well done. Take care.
Take care. Please be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Be assured of that.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Merci.
Beaucoup.
There were certainly a lot of interesting comments in the chat, a lot of passionate remembrances, and a lot of passionate comments about the issues. I appreciated them all. Well done, everybody.
I'd like to ask a question. It's Lee Miller from BC.
Yeah.
I spent many years in the field of recreation therapy, working in long-term care and dementia care. And nowhere in all of this have I heard any commentary about the role that the recreation therapist plays in a long-term care home.